He walked into the courtroom wearing a worn-out army jacket. Torn, stained, his hands were cuffed, his head down. To most people there, he was just another homeless man, a statistic, another black man the system had swallowed and spit out. The bailiff called for silence. The judge scanned the file, and then he read the name loud, clear. James Otis Freeman. The moment that name echoed across the courtroom, everything changed. The judge paused, his eyebrows lifted. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence, and one by one people in that room stood up. No one told them to. No one asked why. They just rose like they were honoring something sacred, because they were. James didn't move, didn't speak. But in that moment, every eye in that room was fixed on him, not with judgment but with awe. This is the story of how a forgotten hero stood trial and reminded the world who he really was. Before the courtroom, before the streets, before the silence, there was James. Born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1972, James Otis Freeman grew up in a world that didn't make space for black boys to dream too big. But he dreamed anyway. His father, a mechanic, his mother, a nurse's aide. Life was modest, but filled with dignity. He was smart, disciplined, quiet. And when he turned 18, he made a decision that would shape everything that came after. He enlisted in the United States Navy. It wasn't about glory. It was about escape, opportunity. A way out of a neighborhood filled with dead ends and broken promises. And in the Navy, James thrived. He trained harder than anyone, learned faster than most, and when he was deployed to the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Storm, he led his unit through one of the deadliest skirmishes of the conflict, risking his life to pull 3 wounded men out of a burning transport vehicle. For that, he was awarded the Bronze Star for valor. Later, the Purple Heart, after surviving an explosion that nearly took his leg. They called him a hero. The newspapers wrote about him. Photos of James in uniform, smiling, proud, made it to local news back home. His mother cried when she saw him on TV. But wars end, and when James came back, the cameras were gone. Home was no longer home. He was changed, not on the outside but inside. The flashbacks, the nightmares, the weight of things he'd seen and done. He tried to work, tried to go back to school, tried to be normal. But nothing worked. The VA clinics were overwhelmed. The paperwork piled up. He waited months for an appointment, only to be handed pills and sent on his way. There were days he couldn't sleep, days he wouldn't eat. And slowly the man they'd once stood and saluted faded into someone the world refused to see. He lost his job, couldn't afford rent. His mother passed away, his friends moved on. And James, he drifted. First couch to couch, then shelter to shelter, and eventually the streets. For 10 years he lived beneath the overpass off I-95 in Baltimore, with a shopping cart, a backpack, and a faded photo of him in uniform tucked deep in his coat pocket. Most people passed by without even looking at him. Some tossed coins, others crossed the street. But James wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He'd sit in the same spot every morning, nod politely to strangers, and disappear into himself. He read books from the library, kept a worn notebook where he scribbled poetry, journal entries, and pieces of his old self he was afraid to forget. He survived off soup kitchens, church handouts, and the kindness of a few who knew his name. But hunger doesn't wait for charity. And one cold January morning, James walked into a corner store, grabbed a turkey sandwich and a bottle of apple juice, and walked out without paying. It wasn't planned. It wasn't defiant. He was just hungry. The store clerk yelled after him, then called the police. They found James 4 blocks away, sitting on a bench unwrapping the sandwich. He didn't run, didn't lie. He just looked up and said, "I'll give it back when my check comes, I swear." They arrested him anyway. The charge? Misdemeanor theft. In most cases it would have meant a warning or a fine, but James had priors: sleeping in public, loitering, minor trespassing. Nothing violent, nothing malicious, but enough to make the system label him a repeat offender. That's how he ended up in front of Judge Langston, a no-nonsense man known for harsh sentences. The courtroom was half empty that day. A slow Tuesday. Public defenders flipping through folders, a few bored reporters, no one expecting anything remarkable, until the clerk called his name. Defendant James Otis Freeman. The judge scanned the record. Then his eyes locked on the military section. His posture changed. He looked at James more closely now. Something clicked. "Are you the same James Freeman who served in Desert Storm?" he asked. James nodded once. The judge stood. Silence. And slowly, others began to rise too. Prosecutors, officers, even strangers who had no idea why, but felt they should. James didn't ask for any of that. He wasn't expecting it. And as he looked around, his eyes welled with something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Not pity, not sympathy. Honor. For the first time in over a decade, someone had remembered who he was. If this story moved you even a little, make sure you hit subscribe right now, because this story isn't over, not even close. What happens next will leave you speechless. No one in that courtroom could fully explain why they stood, but they did, as if somehow deep down they understood that justice wasn't just about laws, it was about dignity. The judge cleared his throat. For a moment, he looked more like a man than a robe. "Mr. Freeman," he said, "this court owes you more than just a hearing, it owes you respect." James didn't speak, didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than any testimony could. The prosecutor, a young white man in a pressed suit, shuffled papers awkwardly. The theft charge suddenly looked smaller, insignificant. He whispered to the assistant DA beside him. Then he stood. "Your Honor," he said, voice softening, "given the circumstances, we're willing to drop the charges." Gasps echoed. The clerk looked confused. Even the public defender blinked in disbelief. The judge nodded slowly. "Motion granted." James turned slightly, his hands still cuffed in front of him. "Does that mean I can go?" The judge looked at the bailiff. "Uncuff him." And just like that, for the first time in years, James Otis Freeman stood not as a defendant, but as a free man. But freedom, in James's world, wasn't simple. He still had nowhere to sleep. No job, no family waiting outside. The courtroom emptied quickly. People moved on like they always do. But one person stayed behind. Her name was Eliza Grant, a local journalist, mid-30s, sharp eyes, thick curls tied back in a loose bun. She'd been covering another case, but when the room stood for James, she felt something shift. She approached him gently, notebook tucked under her arm. "Mr. Freeman," she said, "do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" James raised an eyebrow, a little skeptical. "What for?" "I want to tell your story," she said, "the whole story." He hesitated, then shrugged. "If you think anyone's still listening." She smiled. "They will." Over the next few weeks, Eliza visited James almost daily. She brought coffee, sometimes a sandwich, but mostly she brought time, the one thing no one had offered him in years. She asked questions, took notes, listened. He told her about the war, about his unit, about his mother's funeral and how he couldn't afford the bus fare to get there, about the nights he'd sleep under newspapers and write poems no one would ever read. And slowly, she built a picture, not of a criminal, but of a man this country had failed. When her article finally published, the headline was simple: "From Hero to Homeless, the Forgotten Life of James Otis Freeman." The piece went viral. TV stations picked it up. Veterans groups started calling. Donations poured in. Old Navy friends reached out. Men James hadn't heard from in 2 decades. They sent letters, photos, memories. One even flew from Texas just to shake his hand. With help from the community, James was placed in transitional housing. A clean bed, a door that locked, a hot shower. Small things that most people take for granted, but to James they felt like luxury. The city fast-tracked his VA benefits. Therapy, healthcare, pension. Finally, the system began to catch up with the man it had forgotten. Eliza didn't stop writing. She kept following his journey, publishing updates. But she also did something more personal. She helped James self-publish his journal. Those poems and writings he thought no one would ever read. It was titled Under the Overpass. And when it launched, The first print run sold out in 2 days. One rainy evening months later, Eliza found James sitting alone on a park bench, this time with a wool coat, clean-shaven and reading a book. She sat beside him. "You good?" she asked. He nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time." She smiled, pulling her scarf tighter. "Do you ever think about that day in court?" James chuckled. "Every day. But not 'cause they stood up for me." "Why then?" "Because that's when I realized I hadn't disappeared. I was just waiting to be seen." James Otis Freeman didn't ask for sympathy. He never wanted attention. He wanted a chance, a voice, a place to stand and be counted. There are thousands like him, black veterans, sons of this country, heroes in silence. They don't all get the moment James did, but they all deserve it. Next time you pass someone on the street, don't just see the struggle. Remember, there's always more beneath the surface, a name, a history, a life. Because sometimes when the world finally stops to listen, even a courtroom can rise.